in the story of my father, Kurt. He was born in 1924, and he grew up Jewish in Nazi Germany. So just a quick recap for those who were here and those who were not. In the first story of Kurt's life, we discussed what happened to him and his family in November of 1938 when Kristallnacht and violence came to their small village of Halle in November of 1938. And then we also followed their journey as they escaped Nazi Germany through the port of Hamburg in the spring of 1939. And we journeyed with their refugee ship, which was named Usaramo, to ports in Angola and Mauritius and Indonesia. So we've come a long way. Tonight's story is entitled Yin and Yang. And in this story, the family arrives in Shanghai and settles there for the first 2.5 years of a very long time. They were there for 8 years in total, but we're just going to cover the first part of it. Shanghai began as a tiny fishing village in the 3rd century BC, where the Yangtze River meets the China Sea. And about the same time in history, the concept of yin and yang developed in Chinese philosophy and mythology. Yin and yang were said to have been born out of chaos when the universe was first formed and lived in harmony at the center of the earth. In yin and yang thinking, it is the nature of all things to exist with dual qualities, light and dark, young and old, rich and poor. Central European Jewish refugees began fleeing to Shanghai in the 1930s to escape anti-Semitism and Nazi persecution in Europe. As all other nations and cities barred entry to these refugees, Shanghai remained the one destination where these people could enter. No visa was required for immigration to Shanghai. And as a result, it's estimated that between 17,000 and 20,000 Jewish refugees fled to Shanghai during that period. Among them were families like ours that were actually mixed marriages, yin and yang. In the Nazi paperwork that they had to obtain in order to leave Germany, Kurt's father was identified as Jewish, and his mother was identified as Protestant. Now, in Nazi thinking, unlike in yin and yang thinking, it is not the nature of things to exist with dual qualities. So these two children, Kurt and his sister Hannelore, were an abomination to the Nazis. And they were identified on their paperwork as dissident. Now, Nazi Germany and its Moors must have seemed like a distant planet to Kurt and Hannelore as the Usaramo, their steamship, finally arrived in the Yangtze River Delta, and they beheld Shanghai for the first time. Densely populated, multicultural, intertidal, and utterly chaotic. Shanghai was the very embodiment of dissidence and duality. So much so that in that era, it was known both as the Paris of the Orient and the wickedest city on earth. It was the last day of June, 1939, and the Delta reeked of coal smoke, raw sewage, industrial fumes, decaying fish, and sweat. Kurt and Hannelore gaped out at the ship's railing at an amalgam of harbor slums, shipping docks, poverty. It was as endless and dense as the tropical air that day. After about 12 miles of this, the Usaramo steered left into the Huangpu River, which is a tributary of the Yangtze, setting its final course for the international settlement, where their ship would dock and they would finally arrive. In the murky and tainted waters around their ship, They would have seen little wooden sampans, hand-built, and on those little watercraft, some were used as fishing vessels, others were carrying the delta's abundant fruits and vegetables to market. And on those little sampans, the brother and sister would have seen children their age and younger, skinny, malnourished children, laboring alongside their parents. And many of those families were living in cramped living quarters that were constructed right on those little watercraft. And at the same time, in contrast to the poverty and pollution, there were luxury ocean liners in port with the flags of nations from all over the world. And mixed in with that, there were battleships and gunboats of the Japanese, British, and American military garrisons that were all there in Shanghai to protect their financial and territorial interests. They had arrived at their destination, and it seemed that they had arrived at the confluence of all things, east and west, poverty and wealth, war and ceasefire. This is how Kurt remembered what happened next. We arrived, the ship set anchor, they unloaded us, and we went through Chinese customs. And then they put us on trucks, and they took us to the camps. We were housed in an abandoned school. It was a harbor slum area because there were so many abandoned buildings there. And it wasn't just one school. It was a group of schools with outbuildings and trees and greenery and what have you. We were put in a classroom that was outfitted with double-decker bunk beds. Beds were put together in groups of 4, and since we were a family of 4, it worked out okay. The refugee agency that was coordinating all of this was called CFA, the Committee for the Assistance of Jewish Refugees in Shanghai. And this harbor slum area was a district known as Hongqiu that had a complicated history. Hongqiu had once been designated the American sector of Shanghai in the late 19th century, and then it was combined with the British sector to form an area known as the International Settlement that was pretty much the heart of Shanghai. It was governed by a Shanghai Municipal Council made up of many nations. One of those nations was Japan, and they had great aspirations in China. In 1937, 2 years before my father and his family arrived, the Japanese Imperial Army launched a full-scale invasion of China right through Shanghai. The Battle of Shanghai was a 3-month siege. It was so bloody, it later became known as Stalingrad on the Yangtze, and it had left Hongqiu largely destroyed. So by the time these thousands of Jewish refugees began arriving, most of the buildings in Hongqiu were either destroyed or abandoned. And so CFA was able to repurpose them to house refugees. But in a word, Kurt summed up their existence there as miserable. The conditions were overcrowded, the sanitation was poor, and there was very limited amounts of food for people to eat. So it was not a very nice existence. Then after a couple of months, things started to look up a little bit when 2 people arrived named Miss Yan and Mr. Bover. Miss Yan was one of a group of Christian missionaries who started visiting the refugee camp. Most of the Christian missionaries were British or American, and they had a hard time communicating with the refugees who were largely German. But Miss Yan was Swiss and bilingual and could serve as an interpreter. So she began visiting the camp, and she brought her fiancé, Mr. Bover, who was half Jewish. He'd been a policeman in Berlin before he fled to Shanghai. In Kurt's memories, the missionaries were coming not really to convert people, but because they had been pushed out of the interior of China by the war between the Chinese and Japanese, and they found themselves in Shanghai with very little to do. So they wanted to help the refugees, and they came to the camp looking for families like his, where there was a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. And the relationship sort of built over a number of weeks. The missionaries would visit, they would bring treats like candy or fresh bread, and they got to know Kurt and his family and the other mixed marriages like theirs. Miss Jan noticed that Kurt spoke very good English and could help serve as an additional interpreter. And she also noticed that Kurt's mother, my grandmother, was very skilled in housekeeping and cooking, maybe reminiscent of Miss Jan's own mother back in Switzerland. So one day, Miss Jan and Mr. Bover approached Kurt and the other families with an idea. They had an abandoned mission school in that same district, and they had the idea of creating a school for those children of mixed marriages. They were looking for some families to help, and as Kurt said, we immediately volunteered. We would do anything to get out of those community kitchens and shared toilets. So Kurt and his family and some of the other families volunteered to do the carpentry and the painting, and Miss Jan put Kurt's mother in charge of the kitchen because she was a very enthusiastic cook. The weather began to get cooler, fall came, and before you knew it, the mission school was ready to go. So now things were really changed for Kurt and his family. His father had work as the custodian at the mission school. His mother had work running the kitchen. And as Kurt said, Hannelore and I had 3 good meals a day, and we got to start attending classes. The other thing Kurt told me was his favorite and most interesting thing he thought about the mission school was that it was built next to a geisha house. And this is where the Japanese military officers were entertained in the evening. So Kurt said to me later in life, I was lying in bed at night and listening to those geisha girls play those interesting instruments and sing their geisha songs. I thought that was utterly fascinating. So things went on well at the mission school, and Kurt and Hannelore had refuge from the situation they'd been in before, and their lives improved greatly. And this lasted for 2 years. Kurt aged from 15 to 17, Hannelore aged from 11 to 13. They became good English speakers, made friends, explored Shanghai, ate all kinds of strange food, but they had the opportunity to grow and mature. I think of them again as yin and yang. As yin and yang were born out of chaos, Kurt and Hannelore were born into chaos in Europe between the 2 world wars. And as yin and yang found harmony at the center of the earth, Kurt and Hannelore found a couple of years of refuge and safety that allowed them to gather their strength for what was to come. Unfortunately, yin and yang were out of balance in the world. War had now spread through Europe, and it was spreading into Africa and into Asia. December 6th, 1941 was a Saturday night, but the geisha house was oddly quiet. Now, the troops from the British and American military garrisons were in Shanghai living it up like they did every Saturday night, enjoying the offerings of the wickedest city on earth. But the Japanese troops were nowhere to be seen. The next day, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army launched its devastating surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. That was a Sunday. But Shanghai time is 18 hours ahead of Honolulu time. So it was early Monday morning when Kurt and Hannelore heard shelling from the harbor at the Wangpu River, where the Japanese destroyer Izumo was firing on the USS Wake and the HMS Petrel. In a few hours, the Japanese troops would invade and occupy Shanghai, and everything would change. In Yin and Yang thinking, it is the nature of all things to exist with dual qualities: East and West, life and death, joy and sorrow. Kurt and Hannelore would experience all of those things over the next 6.5 years that they spent in Shanghai. And I hope to return and tell you more about that in future stories on Friday. But for tonight, I am grateful to Miss Yan and Mr. Bover and all the people who worked at that mission school for the refuge and the strength that they gave my ancestors in a district called Hangqiu, in an extraordinary city called Shanghai, that was the Paris of the Orient and the wickedest city on earth. Thank you.